Tonight, a space station stopped cooling. People began collapsing in the corridors. But the heat was not a malfunction. It was a policy, and one engineer found the stamp that proved it. The first sign was not a warning on a screen. It was a man folding in the corridor like his bones had turned soft. Right in front of the night shift line. His sanitation cart rolled into the wall and rattled to a stop. And warm air clung to everyone like wet cloth. "Feels like they are charging for night air now?" the man said, forcing a laugh as he pushed himself up. "My mother says it is the heat tithe. Someone upstairs decided comfort is a privilege." Another worker replied. Calder Muir kept walking, but the words stayed lodged under his ribs. People named a threat when they could not name a person. And Lower Gerd had started naming it all week. The corridor felt like late afternoon even though station clocks insisted it was deep night. Wall fans ran past their rest cycle and began to whine. A thin metal song that made people glance up and then keep going. Greens turned limp before the end of a shift, and bread sweated inside its wrap. Tonight, the night never arrived. Calder stopped at a vent grill and pressed his palm to the seam. The panel was warm. It should have been cool by now. Because Cinderwake Station lived on a simple rhythm in the Nexus belt. Work made heat, radiators bled it away, and night gave everyone a few hours to recover. He ducked into a maintenance alcove and pulled up the district map. Lower Gerd should have been shading toward blue, but the curve climbed in a steady, patient line, as if the station had decided to keep its fever. Calder overlaid the last 12 hours with a normal week, and the line split right where the midnight drop should have begun. If the drop did not return before shift change, Ward Gray would drown in heat injury. That was the kind of math a station could not negotiate. Calder opened radiator output and froze. Radiator fields were capped across multiple sectors. The caps were not safety limits. They were quotas, each one carrying the same administrative stamp. Heat Ledger Office. Calder stared at the tag and felt anger rise under the fear. The Heat Ledger Office handled disputes and rationing, not the breathing of the station skin. Budgets did not belong in radiator control. A medical alert chimed across general traffic. Ward Gray requested assistance. Heat injury intake rising. Calder shoved his toolkit closed and moved fast, boots biting the deck as he cut through crowds that were already too quiet. The air grew cleaner as he climbed toward the clinical deck, and that contrast made the heat below feel less like accident and more like design. Ward Gray was crowded with bodies on cots and on the floor. People fanned themselves with ration cards. Lips cracked, eyes glassy. A nurse tried to joke with an old man, but the man's smile did not land, and the joke died in the heat. Doctor Liora Keth stood at triage with sleeves rolled and hair bound tight. She was not human, but she wore the same plain coverall as the staff, and she moved like someone who had already decided there was no time for anyone's discomfort. She saw Calder and came to him without wasting a step. "Engineer Muir," she said. "Lower Gerd should cool at night." Calder said, "It is not cooling. What are you seeing?" "I see sustained exposure," Liora replied. "Not a spike. People are not stepping into a hot room. They're living in one." She lifted a tablet. Admissions rose in clusters, repeating at the same hours. From the same blocks. The pattern was too clean to be chance, and too cruel to be weather. "My species does poorly with prolonged heat," she said. "I learned your guidelines because I had to. But the station is forcing people to learn the hard way." Calder looked at a child on a cot. Skin flushed, breathing too fast. The child's mother kept fanning with a ration card until her wrist shook. "If it stays like this, we lose the fragile first," Liora said. "Then the ones who pretend they're fine." Calder kept his voice low. Because fear traveled faster than air. "Radiator fields are capped," he said. "The caps are tagged by the Heat Ledger Office." Liora held his gaze like she was pinning him to the only question that mattered. "Then someone decided who is allowed to recover," she said. A nurse cracked the side room door and whispered that 2 more had arrived from Lower Gerd. Liora nodded once, then turned back to Calder. "Find who wrote the caps," she said, "but do not touch valves blindly. If you trigger a cascade, you will add panic to heat." "I will not move blind," Calder said. I will trace the control chain. Liora's expression softened by a fraction. Not comfort, just recognition. I will keep them alive long enough for you to do it, she said. Calder went to the administrative ring. The heat ledger office sat behind glass where lights never flickered and corridors never smelled like sweat. A clerk looked up as Calder entered, already wary. I am here about radiator caps. Who authorized them? Calder asked. The clerk tapped a screen and slid it across without meeting his eyes. The authorization was clean, stamped, and confident. The signature at the bottom read, Galen Price. Calder copied the authorization and left before the clerk could find a question. Price was logistics director, the man who made scarcity look like policy. If Price was in the radiator chain, it was not a mistake. Price's office overlooked Glasswalk Ring, where shops still sold warm drinks and private vents still hummed softly behind polished walls. The contrast made Calder's hands tighten until his knuckles ached. Galen Price stood beside a wall display of supply routes. He looked up with the calm of someone who did not fear bad news. Engineer Muir, Price said, you move quickly. Lower gird is overheating, Calder said. Your office capped the radiator fields. People are collapsing. Price gestured to a chair. Calder stayed standing, because sitting felt like agreement. You think this is greed or incompetence? Price said. It is neither. It is survival. Calder set the authorization on Price's desk. Budgets do not belong in radiator control, he said. Price tapped the wall display. A heat map of the station pulsed bright around reactors and industry. Beyond it were faint probability rings, like eyes in the dark. The quiet siege is not a metaphor, Price said. There are watchers. If we radiate too strongly, we become a beacon. We have no escorts. We have discipline. Calder heard the logic and hated that it had edges. Then explain Glasswalk Ring, Calder said. Explain why the upper ring cools normally. Certain functions must remain stable. Price replied. Command, fabrication, communication. If they fail, everyone dies. And lower gird is the workforce, Calder said. Which is why lower gird gets managed. Price replied. Higher ambient, shorter cooling windows. It is tolerable for limited intervals. Calder thought of Liora's intake chart. Limited intervals are warnings, not schedules, he said. Price opened a drawer and placed a thin token on the desk with a stamped seal. Therm credit key, Price said. Priority cooling windows. People who contribute more to station survival receive more stability. Incentive, not cruelty. Calder stared at it. It looked like money, but it bought sleep. You are selling cool air, Calder said. I am allocating heat rejection capacity. Price replied. Physics does not care what you call it. Calder leaned in, voice tight. Open the caps on lower gird and distribute properly, he said. Keep your total threshold. Stop the collapse. Price watched him for a long beat, then spoke softly, like a favor. I will open additional windows for Ward Gray, he said. I will authorize extra coolant ration for your loops. In return, you sign compliance. You state the caps are necessary and the system is operating as designed. Calder felt the trap close around his throat. If I refuse? He asked. Then you become a liability in a siege, Price replied. Liabilities lose access. As Calder stepped into the corridor, a figure in station security colors detached from the wall like a shadow that had learned to walk. The man was tall, uniform pressed, eyes flat. Engineer Muir, he said. Commander Kane Rusk. Calder kept his badge visible and his face neutral. Am I being detained? Calder asked. Not yet, Rusk replied. His voice was quiet enough that nearby clerks would not hear, and confident enough that Calder understood the threat anyway. Director Price runs a tight ship during the quiet siege. People who create noise become hazards. I am trying to keep citizens alive, Calder said. Try it without touching restricted systems, Rusk replied. Accidents happen in maintenance spaces. Latches fail, suits tear. I would hate to file that report. He stepped aside, making the corridor feel narrower. Go back to your loops, Engineer, Rusk said. Let budgets stay budgets. Calder walked past him without answering. This was not a disagreement. It was a line drawn in metal. He found Liora back in Ward Grey, hands stained with cooling gel, voice steady as she guided a frightened patient through slow breathing. Calder waited until she stepped away from the cot. He says it is discipline, Calder said. He says radiating too much makes us a beacon. Liora did not blink. That can be true, she said, but it can also be used. He is selling priority windows with therm credit keys, Calder said. Then it is control, Liora replied. Calder lowered his voice. He offered to help the clinic if I sign compliance, he said. Liora looked at him as if she was measuring what kind of man he would be tomorrow. If you sign, you save a few now and bury the rest, she said. If you refuse, he will punish you in the ward. Either way, people pay. Calder nodded once. I need proof beyond screens, he said. I need to see the radiator fields. I need to know what is capped and what is diverted. Outer skin access is monitored, Liora said. Security will notice. I can move through maintenance, Calder said, but I need you. I need someone who can read the human cost while I read the hardware. Liora did not hesitate. Then you have me, she said. Calder exhaled, and the exhale felt like the last clean breath before a dive. Then we do not give them time, he said. They left through a service corridor that smelled of lubricant and damp insulation. Calder opened a panel and led her into the crawl space where pipes ran hot along the wall. The deeper they went, the warmer the metal felt, proof that heat was being held like debt. At the maintenance hatch toward the outer structure, Calder paused with his hand on the latch. If we go out there, we might see something we cannot unsee, he said. Liora placed her hand over his. Skin cooled despite the surrounding heat. Then we make sure it is worth it, she said, for the people who cannot argue with the ledger. Calder nodded. He opened the hatch, and cold, thin air washed over them. Ahead, a narrow passage ran along the station skin toward the radiator fields. Toward the truth behind the caps. And toward the people who believed comfort could be turned into currency. 2 hours after Calder and Liora left Ward Grey, the outer skin corridor felt sharper and colder than the wards below. The air was thin, but the metal under their boots carried stored warmth, a pulse trapped in the frame. Calder checked the seal on Liora's suit collar. Are you good? He asked. I am breathing, Liora replied. That is enough. Her voice sounded steady, but the suit readout told a quieter story. Her oxygen draw was rising, a sign her body was working harder than she wanted to admit. They moved along the service spine until the hatch opened onto the radiator fields. Panels spread like dark wings, scarred by old impacts and patchwork plates. At this hour they should have been shedding heat with a steady glow. But their output was muted, as if someone had put a lid on the station. Calder clipped his tether and pulled up telemetry. Caps marched across the display, sector after sector, all under the same quota profile. He crawled to a manifold and pressed his gloved palm to the pipe. It was warm, not hot, as if the flow had been choked upstream. If you are right, people are being cooked by paperwork, Liora said. Calder opened a control box and exposed a cluster of drift valves. The hardware looked freshly serviced. Not failed. It was a clamp, signed by an administrative token. He traced the actuator leads and saw the lock state pinned in place. No error codes, no safety trip, no damaged seals, just a sealing that made the station hold its breath. Calder found faint tool scuffs around the drift valve housing, the kind left by a calibrated wrench. Not a hurried repair. Someone had adjusted the valves with care, then logged it as routine, as if choking a district was maintenance. Beyond the valves, a row of hush sinks sat engaged. They were meant for brief windows during the quiet siege. Left on, they turned cooling into rationing. A voice crackled from a maintenance node. Engineer Muir, you are standing in a restricted workflow, the voice said. Calder froze. Evo? He asked. Evo Marin's face appeared on Calder's wrist display, lit by the blue glow of a cramped server bay. I should not be on this channel, Evo said. You woke my alerts. What are you doing out there? I need logs, Calder replied. The ones that do not get polished. Ivo hesitated, jaw tight. I like my job, he said. I like breathing without asking permission. Then he sent a packet anyway. That is the ledger cut, Ivo said. Quota pushes. Valve locks. Hush sync engagement. It is scheduled. Calder watched the file populate. Timestamps aligning with Leora's intake clusters. The spikes were placed. Liora leaned closer to the display. How long has this been running? She asked. Since the supply route went dark, Ivo replied. Since Galen Price took control of temporary measures. We take this to the Station Authority Council, Calder said. There is no council when Kane Rusk is on duty, Ivo replied. He swallowed. If you want to live long enough to use that file, do not let them see you carry it. A proximity chirp rose in Calder's ears. A shadow crossed the panel and a Blackfin drone drifted into view. Then a second, angling to box them in. Leora's hand closed around Calder's sleeve. Calder? She asked. Ivo's voice sharpened. Get back inside, he said. I can stall the door log for a minute. Calder pocketed the data and slammed the access plate shut. He pushed off the truss, hauling Liora with him as their tethers snapped taut. The drones followed, quiet and close. Out here they did not need weapons. They only needed the airlock. Calder kept his tether line short and pulled in steady, controlled motions. A sudden jerk could tear a seal or slam Liora into a strut. They hit the hatch and dropped into the corridor. Calder slapped the close control and heard the lock cycle. Ivo had bought them seconds. As the inner door sealed, Liora let out a thin breath. Now we know, she said. Then we stay ahead of their locks, Calder replied. By the time they reached the medical ring, Ward Gray had added more cots to the hallway. Mira Sorn was taping a note to a supply cart, hands shaking from exhaustion. How bad? Liora asked. Fainting in lower gird, Mira replied. Same blocks, same hours. We cool one patient and 3 more arrive. Calder showed Liora the ledger cut. Liora scanned the repeated lock states and quotas pulsing like a metronome. It is a schedule, she said. A schedule that turns bodies into numbers, Calder replied. A summons hit Calder's badge. Galen Price requested their presence. Immediate. Mira watched Calder's face. Do not let him make you sign something, she said. Paper follows you longer than heat. He wants obedience, Calder said. Galen Price met them in a conference room that looked out on Glasswalk Ring. Bright and calm, cool air hissed from discreet vents. And Calder hated how good it felt. I heard you took a walk on the outer skin, Price said. I heard you locked radiator fields with administrative tokens, Calder replied. Price nodded once. You understand why, he said. The quiet siege is real. Watchers red heat. If we flare, we get found. If we get found, we get stripped. If we fail, everyone dies. We can keep totals low and still distribute by medical need, Calder said. Lower gird is not recovering at night. Price slid a sealed container across the table. Coolant ration, fresh and labeled. He placed a therm credit key beside it. The tithe seal stamped clean. Sign compliance, Price said. You certify the thermal system is operating within policy. In return, I open a cooling window for Ward Gray each cycle and release this ration. He tapped the key. And you get a private window, he said. You will sleep. You will think clearer. Calder did not touch either item. He pictured Ward Gray quieter for one night. Myra's hands steady again. Liora not burning through her oxygen. Then he pictured lower gird paying for that quiet. Liora stared at the container. Then looked at Price. A hospital cannot survive on the deaths of its intake zone, she said. Prioritize by physiology, not by money. Price's smile carried no warmth. This is not a clinic problem, he said. It is a war problem. I am preventing the larger grave. Calder set the ledger cut on the table. These locks are timed to pressure, he said. Timed to make people beg for exceptions. Price did not flinch. People respond to incentives, he said. Discipline does not come from kindness. Leora's eyes narrowed. You call it discipline, she said. I call it controlled suffering. Price lowered his voice. Take the deal, he said. Save Ward Gray. Stop digging. You keep this up and the station will need a culprit. It will not be me. Calder pushed the coolant container back. If I sign, I become the seal on your heat tithe. He said, no. The door opened behind them. Commander Kane Rusk stepped in without asking. Price spoke calmly. Escort them back to duty. Price said, increase monitoring on their access ports. Rusk nodded. As you wish, he said. In the corridor, Rusk walked close enough that Calder could hear his breath. You refused a gift, Rusk said. That habit gets corrected. Is that a threat? Calder asked. It is a forecast, Rusk replied. Maintenance corridors are dangerous. Doors stick, latches fail, suits tear. Touch restricted systems again and you lose your badge. Or you lose something you care about more. 3 hours later, Lower Gird turned into a clinic without walls. Calls came as gasps over emergency traffic. Then as shouting. Then as silence. Mira ran with a cart of saline and cooling packs. When she saw Calder and Liora, she pointed down the corridor. Block 16, she said. They are dropping. Block 16 was a strip of cramped doors and shared washrooms. Heat rolled out of it like a tide. People leaned against bulkheads, mouths open, eyes unfocused. A child sat on the floor with a cup of water and could not lift it. Mira knelt beside a teenage boy and checked his neck. Pulse is fast, she said. He needs airflow and water. She looked up at Calder. What did they do? She asked. Calder pulled up district telemetry. The curve spiked, not from failure, but from an imposed ceiling that dropped cooling capacity to almost nothing. A label flashed. Thermal blackout window. Calder's stomach tightened. This was not shortage. This was a lesson. Drones hovered near the ceiling, quiet and watching, their lenses tracking faces. Liora breathed slowly, steadying herself against heat that hit her harder. Kane Rusk, she said. He wants the ward to beg. Calder tried to reach the thermal control board. A red lockout answered him. Administrative override. He looked at Mira and then at the crowd. Move everyone toward the service vents. Calder said. Any airflow helps. Split the crowd. Do not let them pile up. Mira nodded and began shouting instructions. Voice cracking but clear. To the vents, she said. Stay low. Sip water. If you feel dizzy, sit. Liora moved through the crowd, checking eyes and skin. She stopped beside an older woman whose lips had gone dry and gray. Then looked at Calder. If this continues, we lose her, Liora said. Calder stepped into a maintenance alcove and ripped open the panel. Behind it, an old bypass junction sat unused, tagged non-essential during the quiet siege. Now it looked like a door. He pulled a slim device from his kit. Cold key splice. Not fix, Calder said. Break. Liora met his eyes. If you do this, they will come for you, she said. If I do not, they will keep doing this, Calder replied. Calder set the cold key splice against the junction. The indicator blinked, waiting, as if the station was asking if he meant it. I mean it, he whispered, and turned the key. For a heartbeat nothing happened. Then the bypass junction vibrated, and a cool pulse moved through the line like water finding a crack. The nearby vents exhaled air that felt a degree less cruel. Mira felt it first and looked up, startled. Something changed, she said. Above them, a Blackfin drone shifted position and turned its lens toward the open panel. A sharp tone echoed from its speaker, not a warning for the crowd, but a signal to someone listening. Calder closed the panel, but he did not lock it. Liora pressed a cooling pack into the older woman's hands and nodded to Mira to keep moving. For the first time in hours, the corridor stopped getting hotter. That was when Calder heard heavy boots on the stairwell. A stairwell door clanged open behind Calder Muir. Boots hit the steps with slow certainty. Commander Kane Rusk had arrived to collect a lesson. Calder kept his shoulder over the open access panel. The cold key splice still hummed in his palm, feeding a thin ribbon of cooler air into Lower Gird. Doctor Liora Keth stood in front of the crowd and spoke like a clinician. Not a rebel. Families first, she said. 2 at a time. Hold the rail. Mira Sorn pushed a cart of cooling packs forward. She did not look up at the ceiling cameras. And she acted like this was ordinary triage. Rusk stepped into the corridor with 2 officers. And a Blackfin drone drifted above his shoulder. Engineer Muir, Rusk said, step away from the panel. People are dropping, Calder replied. This is an emergency. Rusk's face stayed blank. An emergency does not change authority. He said, you accessed restricted routing. Liora turned her head toward him. Your routing is killing them, she said. Rusk glanced at her suit collar. Dr. Keth, return to your assigned deck, he said. Mira set her card across the hallway. You will have to climb over sick people, she said. For a moment, Rusk listened to wheezing breaths. Then he chose the option that cost him nothing. Clear this corridor in 10 minutes, he said. After that, anyone here is trespassing. Calder understood the trap. If the hall emptied, the blackout could finish unseen. If they stayed, Rusk could arrest them and shut the bypass. Liora did not argue. She turned back to the residents and gave simple steps. Small sips of water, she said. Stay low near the vents. If you feel dizzy, sit where you are. She pointed Mira toward the fragile first. Children, elders, and anyone with shaking hands, Liora said, move them before they feel brave enough to refuse help. Mira nodded and began calling names she already knew. A neighbor lifted a neighbor without making a scene, and a mother kept one hand on the rail and one on her child's shoulder. Calder watched the corridor thermometer drift down by a few degrees, and a man who had been slumped against the bulkhead blinked and sat up. The man tried to thank Calder, but the words came out as a rasp. Liora knelt beside him and checked his pulse with 2 fingers. Save your breath, she said. Stand when you can. The man nodded and took a careful step toward the elevator, and a teenager guided him along. For a brief stretch, the corridor sounded almost normal. Calder checked his wrist display. The bypass was holding, but the backbone was watching. He leaned close to Liora. Get the worst cases to Ward Gray, he said. Keep it quiet, no crowds. Liora nodded once, and her fingers brushed his wrist as she turned away. It was not a confession, just a promise to keep moving. When the 10 minutes ended, the corridor was almost clear and the last residents were carried on doors and blankets. Rusk walked down the hall, slow and certain, and stopped beside the open panel. Shut it, he said. Calder held his breath and listened for anyone still lying behind him. The hallway was empty now. He pulled the cold key splice free, and the vents sighed warmer air at once. A woman at the corner looked back and nodded in silence. Rusk watched the alert on his own wrist. There, he said, unauthorized routing, recorded and time-stamped. Now you come with me. They did not lock Calder in a cell. They placed him in a glass room that smelled of clean filters. And Galen Price waited inside with hands folded like a man in control. A screen on the wall showed Ward Gray intake numbers climbing again. You forced my hand, Price said. You scheduled a blackout, Calder replied. You turned heat into punishment. Price did not deny it. He spoke like this was inventory. People learn faster when consequences are immediate, he said, and the quiet siege does not reward softness. Calder kept his voice level. You are hiding behind the siege, he said. Your caps are tighter than the threat requires. Price tapped the wall screen and brought up a thermal plot. Bright blooms showed reactor load and industry cycles, while faint rings beyond it marked search probabilities like distant eyes. If we radiate freely, we get mapped, Price said. If we get mapped, we get hit. Your clinic does not matter if the station burns. Liora stood beside Calder, hair damp at the roots. We are not debating comfort, she said. We are watching organs fail. Price tapped a control and a tray slid from the wall with a coolant canister and 2 sealed tokens. The tithe seal gleamed on both. Sign compliance, Price said. You certify the caps. You certify the quotas. In return, I open longer cooling windows for Ward Gray. Calder stared at the tokens and imagined Mira getting 1 quiet hour, and Liora not choosing between ice packs and prayers. And lower gird? He asked. Price shrugged. Lower gird will endure, he said. They always do. Leora's voice stayed flat. Endure is a slower death. she said. It is still death. Price leaned back. You are a guest here, he said. Do not tell humans how to survive a siege. Liora did not flinch. I am not a guest in Ward Grey, she said. I am the one who holds their heads when they seize. Calder pushed the tray away. I will not sign, he said. The door opened without warning and Commander Kane Rusk stepped in with a small case. He opened it on the table, showing a tracking collar module and a badge limiter. Price wants you useful, Rusk said. I want you contained. Calder kept his hands at his sides. This is for criminals, he said. It is for risks, Rusk replied, and his eyes flicked to Liora. And you are both risks. Price nodded toward Calder. Give us your bypass code, he said. Every route, every key, every trick. Calder tilted his head. I will not hand you another weapon, he said. Rusk answered without heat. Then we take someone who matters to you, he said. Calder's stomach tightened. He pictured Mira in the ward. Then the tech who had sent him the logs. And then the one person who kept Lower Gird from tearing itself apart. Tamsin Crow, Calder said. Rusk nodded once and left. Price leaned forward, voice soft. You can stop this, Price said. Sign. Hand over the code. Take the coolant. Calder looked at Liora. Her eyes were steady, but her throat moved once. She was afraid, and she stayed. If you give them the code, they will Price life, she said. If you do not, they will hurt her. A message pinged on Calder's wrist display. It was a short clip sent through a security channel. Tamsin's face filled the screen for a moment, flushed and tight, and behind her a wall vent blew warm air. Calder heard her say his name. Then the clip ended. He swallowed hard. I can fix valves, he said. I cannot fix this kind of power. Liora stepped close enough that her shoulder brushed his. You are choosing between immediate pain and slow death, she said. Do not call it your fault. Call it their design. Calder closed his eyes for one breath, then opened them. I keep the code, he said. I keep a path they cannot buy. Price's face showed a thin disappointment. Then she suffers because you are stubborn, he said. Calder leaned forward. She suffers because you need victims, he said. By evening, Ward Grey sounded like a machine. Airflow rose and fell in uneasy cycles. And Mira Sorn moved between cots with dry lips and fast hands. She found Liora near the supply alcove. They took Tamsin, Mira said. Security Detachment 9. No charges. No notice. Leora's jaw tightened. Where? She asked. Detention corridor, Mira replied. They call it questioning. A station announcement rolled through the speakers and Galen Price's voice filled the ward. Polished and calm. Citizens of Cinderwake Station, Price said. An unauthorized heat event occurred in Lower Gird. This act increased our thermal signature. Mira whispered. He is blaming Calder for the risk. Liora stared at the speaker grill. He is teaching the sick to feel guilty, she said. Price continued. In the quiet siege, we survive through discipline. Further interference will be treated as sabotage. The message ended. The ward hum returned, and then a patient began to retch. Liora turned away and went back to work, and Calder arrived with a maintenance bag and a tired face. They will use her to force the code, Calder said. I cannot give it to them. Mira nodded once. If you give it, no one has a lockless path again, she said. Liora spoke low. But we cannot let her die, she said. Calder looked at the ceiling vents and listened to the airflow pattern. Uneven and strained. I can open a new bleed line, he said. Not the main junction, an old industrial spur. It will be small, but it will buy minutes. Mira swallowed. What will Rusk do? She asked. Calder did not lie. He will prove he can still kill without guns, he said. 2 hours later, the proof arrived. Calder's wrist display blinked with a station-wide notice, and civilian cooling allocation dropped to minimum for a short interval. The ventilation tone changed at once. Airflow slowed, then warmed, and heat climbed like a tide returning. Patients groaned. A child cried for water. And Mira moved fast, pressing cooling packs into hands. Liora made hard choices with a soft voice. You, she told a teenager, breathe slow and sip. And you, she told an older man, lie on your side. Her hands trembled once, then steadied again, and she moved to the next cot without a pause. Calder sprinted to the maintenance bay because he needed a crack in their control before bodies piled up. Jonah Silt waited by the crawl space hatch, the old mechanic holding a battered toolkit and a stubborn look. I heard they cut the whole civilian loop, Jonah said. I mapped an ugly bypass years ago. Calder stared at him. Why now? He asked. Jonah's smile was tired. Because now I know what they are, he said. Open the station. Let it breathe. They dropped into the crawl space and the metal was hot enough to sting through gloves. Calder followed Jonah's directions to a corroded junction tagged obsolete, and Jonah pointed to a sideline. It feeds a forgotten radiator spur, Jonah said. Not much, but it is real. Calder worked fast and set a spare splice chip that was weaker than the cold key. It blinked, searching for handshake. Boots hit the corridor outside, and Rusk's voice carried through the grate. Stand down, Rusk said. Step away from the panels. Calder's heart hammered. He did not have time to run, and he had time to finish. Jonah looked back. Get it open, Jonah said. I will slow them. Jonah, no, Calder said. Jonah stepped out into the corridor anyway. Calder heard a scuffle, then a heavy impact against metal. Then Jonah wheeze. The handshake completed. A faint cool vibration moved through the pipe. It was small, but it was life. Calder climbed out and found Jonah on the floor, blood darkening his hair. Rusk stood over him, calm as ever. This is what sabotage brings, Rusk said. Accidents. Calder lunged, but an officer blocked him. Liora's voice came through his calm, strained. Calder, people are crashing. Now? She asked. Jonah's eyes found Calder for a moment. His lips moved, but only air came out. Calder forced himself to lock the junction setting, then ran back toward Ward Gray, leaving Jonah behind. When the short interval ended, airflow returned, and it returned too late for everyone. They carried Jonah into Ward Gray on a service door, and Liora knelt beside him and worked with practiced speed. Then her shoulders sank by a fraction and she looked up at Calder. He is gone, she said. Calder stared at the still face, and Mira stood behind Liora with eyes empty from fatigue. Calder felt something inside him harden. Not rage, not grief alone, but a clear understanding. This is not about valves, he said. It is about who gets to decide who overheats. Liora rose slowly, eyes wet, voice steady. Then we take away the decision, she said, not by asking, by breaking the ledger. Calder nodded once. He looked past the vents and cots toward the ring where Price sat cool. And he understood his next job, not to tune heat, but to end the right to ration it. Calder Muir could tell which deck he was on without looking at a sign. On Glasswalk Ring, the air never tasted used. The corridor fans ran slow and quiet, and people walked like they owned their next breath. He passed a lounge door where a private cooling unit sighed behind polished glass. Inside, a couple laughed over warm drinks like the station had no war and no fever. Calder thought of Lower Gird, where metal walls stayed hot long after shift change, and where Jonah Silt's cot in Ward Gray was now empty. The contrast did not feel like luxury. It felt like a verdict. Doctor Liora Keth kept pace beside him. Do not stare, she said. They record resentment. I am not angry at comfort, Calder said. I am angry at the price tag. They slipped into a service passage and Calder opened Evo Marin's packet again. The ledger-cut logs sat beside Liora's intake curve from Ward Gray. When Calder overlaid them with radiator telemetry, the pattern stopped looking like rationing and started looking like camouflage. Every time Lower Gird lost its night cooling, a different sector gained headroom. The station did not run cooler. It ran quieter in the band that mattered to hostile watchers. An hour later, when the civilian caps eased, the hidden sector dipped back down, like a thief stepping away from a door. Liora pointed at the repeating spikes. Those hours match your industrial cycles, she said. Calder zoomed to a cluster of bays behind privacy barriers. They were labeled logistics and repair. Nothing that would draw attention. Yet their heat output rose like a living thing. Right when lower gird began to cook. Aurelian Warworks, Calder said. Liora looked at him. Weapons production? She asked. War parts, storage, shipping, Calder said. If Price keeps them hidden. He needs a thermal blanket. He is using civilian suffering as that blanket. The idea settled into Calder like grit. Galen Price was not only selling cool hours to the rich. He was feeding a war contractor while pretending the caps were about survival. Liora's voice stayed calm. Then his weak point is not Kane Rusk's drones. She said, it is the claim that this is necessary. We break that claim with evidence. Logs, a map, and your medical statistics, Calder said, and we must show the schedule, not just the pain. And we need a channel that does not pass through Heat Ledger office. Liora said, they will scrub central comms. Calder nodded. Maintenance screens, he said, service panels, anything that mirrors locally. Liora slowed at a hatch and listened to the station tick around them. Pumps pushed, fans cycled, people still tried to live. One more thing, she said, if this hits lower gird like a grenade, you get a riot. Price wins. Calder thought of the people who kept the station moving when management slept. Mira Sorn in triage, Tamsin Crow calming neighbors, Sister Halwyn feeding whole blocks from a thin ration line, Evo hiding in a server bay and still helping. Then we build an ordinary alliance. Calder said, we keep the station steady while the truth spreads. Tamsin Crow arrived at Ward Gray with a security tracker bulging under her collar seal. Kane Rusk had released her, not out of mercy, but as bait. Calder saw it and did not comment, because saying it out loud would make it heavier. Tamsin spoke first. They wanted me to deliver a message. She said, you are supposed to trade your codes for my safety. Mira Sorn stood beside her with a supply crate, jaw tight. He moved the next blackout earlier. Mira said, he wants bodies before morning. Ivo Marin joined through a maintenance relay, his face grainy on Calder's wrist display. Your badge is flagged, Ivo said, every panel touch pings security. Sister Halwyn stepped into the pantry and shut the door gently. She set down a stained ration book like it was a weapon. This is not rumor, she said, I wrote every extra cool voucher I saw. I wrote who paid. I wrote who stopped coming for meals. Liora rested her hand on the book. This is how we keep people from blaming each other. She said, names beat slogans. Calder pulled up a station schematic. I can push a maintenance mirror packet. He said, it will ride the service network and show on local panels. Heat Ledger office cannot intercept every hallway screen. Evo nodded. Doable, he said, but it must be short. The longer it runs, the easier to kill. Tamsin leaned forward. Make it one chain, she said, cut here, sold there, Warworks benefits, Ward Gray fills, then tell people what to do. Mira added, quieter. Tell them how to survive the next window without stampeding. She said, if people run for airlocks, someone gets crushed and Price calls it proof. Sister Halwyn lifted her book a fraction. And tell them where to bring their tokens. She said, some will hate that line. Some will hide, but enough will bring them if they are given a place that feels safe. A hard clunk echoed outside. A second later, Myra's wrist feed flashed that Rusk locks engaged and transit doors were sealing in stages. Not enough to panic the station. Enough to make everyone feel trapped. Liora exhaled through her nose. Controlled. They are isolating lower gird before the next cut, she said. Ivo's voice sharpened. Security is probing the service network. He said, you have one clean send. After that, they block. Sister Halwyn closed her book. If kitchens get sealed, people fight for water, she said, then Price calls it disorder. Calder felt the clock tighten. Heat accumulated. Waiting meant stacking deaths. A few hours later, another ward shift would begin. And the same corridors would feel hotter because they never truly cooled. Tamsin looked at Calder. Publish now, she said, or you publish never. Calder nodded once. Now, he said. Calder built the gray line patch in a maintenance bay with the door half open. ready to run. He wrote plain sentences that could survive one listen, because he imagined an exhausted worker reading it while sweat stung their eyes. He attached 3 proofs. A simplified ledger cut schedule. Liora's intake curve aligned to those windows. A thermal map showing Aurelian warworks rising exactly when lower gird lost relief. He kept each line short and he kept the blame aimed upward, not sideways. He added 2 instructions in the same plain style. If you have priority tokens, bring them to the ration kitchens for redistribution. If you feel ill, move to shared vents and sip water slowly. Liora watched his thumb hover over send. Do it, she said. Keep it calm. Calder sent the packet. Screens flickered across service corridors. Kitchen panels blinked awake. Cheap displays in lower gird showed the same clean message. People did not riot. They moved, quiet and uncertain, toward Sister Halwyn's kitchens. Some carried tokens like contraband. Some carried nothing but questions. Within minutes, Galen Price cut in on a station-wide announcement. Citizens, hostile actors are falsifying maintenance displays. Price said, they are attempting to raise our thermal signature during the quiet siege. Report anomalies and remain calm. Calder felt a grim respect. Price did not deny suffering. He reframed it as protection. And he dared anyone to choose between truth and safety. Kane Rusk responded with something simpler. Ward Gray doors clanged shut. Liora's badge flashed red. A security order hit Calder's private feed. Detain Dr. Liora Keth for thermal sabotage. It read. Myra's voice came fast over comms. They took her at triage. Mira said, detention spine. Tamsin followed. Low. If they move her behind Heat Ledger office, she disappears, she said, and if they break her, they break the ward. Evo whispered, strained. I can blind one camera junction for a short window. He said, not longer. Calder stared at the schematic and saw the real choice. He could try to bargain and roll back the patch. Or he could end Price's central control over cooling distribution. The lever that made heat into law. The station had an old disaster protocol. A shared arbitration mode between operating districts. Price kept it disabled because it was messy. Messy meant shared power. And shared power meant Price could not schedule pain alone. Calder had never wanted shared power more in his life. He opened the arbitration core panel and cut the administrative seal. Alarms recorded his name. He kept moving. The interface demanded key assignment. And Calder redistributed control to multiple operating nodes. Lower gird operations. Ward Gray clinical. Outer skin maintenance. Ration kitchens. Fabrication safety. It would feel to ordinary people like replacing one master key with many smaller keys. No single office could schedule a lethal blackout alone. Any exception required more than one hand. And the hands belonged to people who lived with the consequences. Price tried to seize the keys through an override. The system rejected it. It rejected it again. Then Kane Rusk tried to force doors shut by command. Some doors still obeyed. Others hesitated, waiting for shared approval that never came. Calder spoke into comms. I am moving the keys. He said, hold steady. Mira inhaled sharply. And Liora? She asked. Now, Calder said, we use the fact that Rusk cannot lock every door alone anymore. He pushed an emergency spur route live and keyed it to shared approval. Evo blinded the junction on Calder's mark. Sister Halwyn cleared a hallway by redirecting a ration line. People moving without understanding they were making space for a rescue. Tamsin guided Mira through a side hatch that had just stopped obeying Kane Rusk. Liora appeared in the detention corridor with her hands bound, escorted by an officer whose badge kept failing to open doors. Mira stepped out and struck him with a coolant canister. Fast and clean. Tamsin pulled Liora into the spur passage without a speech. They moved like people who had practiced emergencies their whole lives. No hero poses, just breath and footsteps. Calder met them in the spur and caught Liora by the elbow. Her eyes were clear even as she winced, and he felt a sudden, sharp relief that was not romantic and not soft. You chose the station, Liora said. I chose a station that cannot sell your ward's survival, Calder replied. Behind them, alarms rose and then broke into argument. Lower gird operations refused a punitive blackout. Ward Gray refused a lockout. Outer skin maintenance refused a seal. The new system did not make the siege vanish. It made cruelty expensive. Before dawn, the air in lower gird still felt warm, but it finally began to drift down instead of climbing. The station had not been saved yet. It had only learned that it could say no to one man's ledger. Calder looked down the corridor toward the hot decks and felt the first thin edge of momentum. Price and Rusk would adapt. They always did, but the right to ration death now required more than one signature. And that crack was wide enough to keep a station alive. Calder Muir woke to the smell of hot plastic. It was faint, but it did not belong in the sleeping ring. On Cinderwake Station, that smell meant a panel was close to giving up. The wall display outside Ward Gray pulsed with a new warning. Heat load rising beyond safe recovery. Radiator fields approaching hard limit. The station was running out of places to hide its fever. And the air already felt thicker, like the corridors were holding their breath. Doctor Liora Keth was already on her feet. "They cannot keep it capped," she said. "Not tonight." A station-wide alert followed. Calm and practiced, it announced a venting night. A controlled opening of radiators to prevent cascading failures. It also warned that every non-essential heat source could be ordered dark. Venting meant life. It also meant a brighter thermal signature in the Nexus belt. And the quiet siege had taught everyone to fear being seen. Galen Price appeared on corridor screens within minutes. Face steady, voice warm enough to sound caring. "Citizens, venting will expose us," Price said. "If we flare, we invite targeting. The safest action is restraint." Leora's jaw tightened. "He wants them to accept heat as protection," she said. Calder checked the distributed control nodes he had set in place. Ward Gray had a vote now. Lower gird operations had a vote. Outer skin maintenance had a vote. The heat ledger office no longer held the only key. But Price still held the microphone. A second alert chimed, sharper. An object track was detected beyond the station's sensor fence. The report did not confirm hostile intent. It did not need to. People heard the word track and imagined a weapon. In the ward, Mira Sorn stopped mid-step and stared at her wrist display. "Is it real?" Mira asked. "I do not know," Calder replied, "but the timing helps him." Tamsin Crow pushed through the doorway. Cheeks flushed from running. "Doors are locking again," she said. "Not all of them, just enough to make people feel trapped." Calder kept his voice low. "If Price convinces the council to recap the radiators, we lose people first," he said. "If we vent without control, we may get found." Leora looked at him, eyes clear. "Then we vent and we cut what makes us loud," she said. Calder knew what she meant. Aurelian warworks, fabrication lines, and private cooling suites that burned energy like it was free. Price had hidden war production under the blanket of civilian suffering. Now the blanket was catching fire. Calder requested a shutdown vote across the distributed nodes. He framed it as triage. "Non-essential industry goes dark," he said. "Private cooling returns to baseline. Medical and life support stay first." Approvals came fast from lower gird operations. Ward Gray, ration services, and outer skin maintenance. Aurelian warworks denied, first and loudest. Price cut in on the public channel again. "Production is survival," he said. "If we stop, we starve later." Calder answered on a narrower channel that rode maintenance mirrors and kitchen panels. "People are dying now," he said. "We do not win a future by trading away the present." Outer skin maintenance began shedding load from Aurelian bays. One circuit at a time. Across Glasswalk Ring, private suites dimmed as their cooling quotas dropped to baseline. Complaints flared on paid channels. But those channels no longer held the keys. On the outer skin, radiator fields began to open in stages. Not as a full flare but as a controlled release. Heat streamed out in a pattern designed to bleed pressure without screaming into the dark. Internal temperatures eased by degrees that felt like mercy. In Ward Gray, Leora moved down the line with water, cooling packs, and short instructions. "Slow sips," she told a man with shaking hands. "Am I going to die?" he asked. "Not if you listen," she replied. A blackfin drone hovered at the ward entrance, lens turning toward Calder like an accusation. It drifted closer, then paused as a door lock failed to accept a remote command. The drone backed away, confused, and Calder felt the station shift, just a little, away from fear. Hours later, the object track shifted. It slowed, then angled away. The sensors did not label it friendly. They labeled it no longer closing. Calder watched radiator output hold steady. They were more visible now, even if they were careful. But they were also alive. And alive meant they could choose again. The council chamber was colder than it had any right to be. Galen Price stood at the center table with a thermal chart behind him. Hands open like he was offering safety. Commander Kane Rusk leaned against the wall, silent, eyes scanning exits. Price spoke first. Engineer Muir triggered venting. He said, "This risks detection during the quiet siege." He also ordered an industrial shutdown that damages readiness. Calder answered immediately. It was required, he said. The station was approaching failure thresholds. If radiators stayed capped, we would have lost decks by morning. Liora stepped forward. "We did not stay safe," she said. "We stayed silent. People died quietly." Price turned to her, polite enough to sting. "Dr. Keth, you are not appointed to strategic policy," he said. "I am appointed to the bodies your policy creates," Liora replied. Calder pushed evidence to the council display. The ledger cut schedule aligned to Ward Gray intake. A thermal camouflage map showed Aurelian Warworks spiking under civilian caps. And a list of therm credit exceptions showed who bought relief while others burned. Price did not flinch. "Yes," he said, "we redirected heat rejection capacity to critical war production. You call it cruelty. I call it choosing what keeps us alive later." A council member asked, voice rough. "Later for whom?" the member asked. "Later for the station," Price replied. "History thanks the surviving." Calder kept his voice steady. "You sold cool hours to Glasswalk Ring while Lower Gird baked," he said. "You hid contracts behind quotas and called it discipline." Kane Rusk finally spoke. "This is becoming disorder," he said. "Disorder kills faster than heat." Tamsin spoke from the back, collar still bruised. "Panic comes from secrets," she said. "People can endure hardship. They cannot endure lies." On the wall, the object track warning updated again. Price gestured to it like a sermon. "You see," he said, "we are hunted. Your actions make us bright." Calder pointed to another chart. "We vented and we cut industry," he said. "Our signature rose, then flattened. We did not flare like a beacon. We chose life support over output. And we are still here." A silence held for a beat. Then the operations chair spoke. "We can restore single authority. Or we can accept shared authority." The chair said, "Only one option ends scheduled blackouts." The chair looked at Price. "Director Price, you are relieved of allocation authority pending investigation," the chair said. Price only smiled, thin and certain. "You will regret this when the siege tightens," he said. The chair turned to Kane Rusk. "Commander Rusk, security is restricted to physical safety," the chair said. "No civic lockouts without council approval." Rusk nodded once, eyes hard. As Calder turned to leave, Price spoke, softer. "You broke protocol," Price said. "When someone needs a culprit, they will not pick the council." Calder met his eyes. "Then let them pick me," Calder said. "At least they will be alive to argue." Dawn on Cinderwake Station was a scheduled easing of light panels. But after the venting night it felt like a real morning because the air no longer pressed on lungs like wet cloth. Ward Gray was still crowded. Liora walked past cots and read names on a list Mira had printed and taped to the wall. The names were ordinary. That was the hardest part. Sister Halwyn arrived with thin broth and cups. She poured without ceremony and left extra water by the beds that shook with fever dreams. Tamsin came next, holding returned therm credit keys wrapped in cloth. She set them on the counter like a pile of teeth. "People are turning them in," Tamsin said. "Some are ashamed, some are angry, some just want the station to stop making them choose." Ivo's face appeared on a corner screen. eyes red from no sleep. Heat boards are being copied to public panels. He said, people watch the numbers now. They ask about quotas before they chase rumors. Mira sat on a stool for the first time in what felt like days. They ask who voted, Mira said. They ask why. They ask what changes at night. A message arrived on Calder's wrist display. Pending review. Access limited while investigators assessed unauthorized routing and industrial shutdown authority. The station still wanted a clean story. Calder showed it to Liora. They are going to make me the mistake, he said. Liora looked at the notice. Then at him. You did not do this for praise, she said, so do not demand it. Calder nodded, throat tight. What about you? He asked. Some will never trust me, she said. I am not from here. Mira spoke without looking up. Neither is heat, she said, but we still treat it. Liora looked down the corridor where lower gird families waited for checks. Water, and a few hours of cooler air that no longer had a price tag. I am staying, she said. Outside the ward, a public panel showed the thermal curve for the first time in weeks. Not hidden behind office seals. Below it, a list of who held the keys was posted. A promise that no one hand could close the radiators in secret again. A second board listed the dead, and one name stopped Calder every time. Jonah Silt, the old mechanic who had joked about heat like it was weather. His bunk in lower gird would stay empty, and a section of the ring would remain sealed until crews could strip melted wiring without killing themselves. Calder knew the review notice could become a tribunal. In a siege, leaders loved a single failure they could point to. Liora knew the same, and she would face it twice over. As a doctor who had defied quotas and as an offworlder who refused to leave when blame began to circulate. An older man pointed at the curve and explained it to a teenager in slow words. The teenager asked a question, and the older man answered without shame, then showed where the night drop should be. Calder watched them like he was watching a new kind of safety. The quiet siege still existed beyond the hull. Price would fight for his story. Rusk would wait for a moment when fear made people ask for a strong hand again. But in lower gird, the vents finally cooled at night, and people learned a new habit. They watched the boards. They asked who decided. They refused to let comfort become currency again. In the quiet between alarms, the station breathed, and it kept breathing. Cinderwake Station kept running. Not because it was flawless, but because ordinary people refused to let comfort become a weapon again. The radiator fields still opened with caution under the quiet siege, yet the numbers were no longer hidden behind a single office seal. In lower gird, the night drop returned, and families slept without bargaining for air. Calder Muir did not get a medal, and Doctor Liora Keth did not get an apology, but they did not need either to know what had changed. A station that once sold cool hours now shared the keys, watched the boards, and asked who decided. The scars remained, names remained, and some doors would stay sealed for months. But a new habit had taken root. The habit of checking the heat curve, protecting the fragile first, and refusing to trade away someone else's breath for someone else's profit. If this story stayed with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more American sci-fi stories where survival is real. Love is earned, and the cost of victory is never free.